Ross Ulbricht is serving a double life sentence without parole for all nonviolent charges for creating a website. Please help free this peaceful man. Go to freeross.org and sign and share the petition.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissecting Liberty podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Cotton Archist.
Hello.
And we have on Pause from the Gaslight Hour.
Good evening, folks.
And today we're going to be talking about what makes a culture prone to valuing liberty. And we're going to get into that. But before we do, I just want to mention that my connectivity is a little bit spotty, so I may go silent in parts of this episode, but we'll see. So anyway, Pause. Why don't you get us started on our topic?
So, not exactly sure where you gentlemen would even like me to start, but I think the first topic that has to be tackled before you can really get into the weeds on a subject like this is just what exactly is culture. And we need a really firm understanding of what a culture is and what sort of milieu they develop in before you can even talk about whether X, Y, or Z culture is conducive to a thing in the first place. So, with all of that being said, then, I think we need to talk about culture being in context a set of sort of regional or even localized beliefs and traditions, because that's really what it narrows down to. You know, culture is certainly not bounded by national borders or by racial lines or by really anything you can even imagine. It's almost like soaked not into the soil, but into the souls and the hearts of people who live within indefinite bounds. You know, and I think there's an outwardly geographical limit to where culture can be present, but there's not hard lines around it, obviously.
Well, especially with the advent of online communities, you see culture being permeated through that, and so like you're saying, it's not dictated by geographical limitations.
Yeah, and it's certainly not dictated by Dunbar slots either or anything of that sort. But there is a sort of 6 degrees of separation effect going on, where it does certainly diffuse itself across online communities or non-localized communities, but that the further you get from whatever the theoretical epicenter is, the less rooted it is. And I think that, too, is a component you have to discuss with culture, because I've actually made the claim a couple of times that I'm not entirely sure the United States even actually has developed a culture yet, being such a young nation geographically.
I have a couple of things to put forth, and I'll see if y'all agree with this. Firstly, I think that culture is entirely a voluntary ethical mode. Secondly, I think there are different types of culture. Like something can be entirely regional, like whatever, a type of cooking or a type of artwork. But then other things can be a lot more wide-reaching. Like, the biggest thing I can think of is like the Christian, the prevalence of Christianity in the West. That is spread an incredible amount of land, but it doesn't also mean that other aspects of culture can coexist with Christianity and not interfere with it. And I mean, that can be, you can be Christian and eat XYZ food while other Christians can eat something entirely different and still be Christian. So I think that muddies the water a little bit. But
yeah, the thing with that is Christianity really is not a culture unto itself. And I think modern church history and the current state of United States culture, quote unquote, if we claim the United States has a culture at all, sort of immediately disproves that. Because the phenomena that's known as the cultural Christian has little to do with, generally speaking, the practices of an actual practicing Christian. Is that out of line, or does that make sense?
No, I understand. Yeah, I agree. But I mean, like maybe Judaism is a better example. There are plenty of culturally Jewish people while they don't practice Judaism. But another example is just like the prevalence of quote unquote American culture, like we were talking about Westerns earlier. And
Yes,
just think about all the great spaghetti Westerns that were produced and filmed in Italy.
Some of the real classics, the deep cuts, the hits. So
Oh yeah.
I think it might be fair to say that in the manufactured mythos of American culture, the spaghetti Western is a staple. And, not to get too woke on you guys being away from my home show, but I might even posit that is intentionally engineered, and that a lot of our mores and cultural traditions here in the U.S. were explicitly manufactured to try and artificially, I'm going to use a goofy word here, but I think it's the completely correct one in context, to artificially inseminate these concepts into our cultural landscape.
Well, I want to get into that, but before we do, I do want to kind of drill down on what your thoughts are in terms of what defines like a naturally occurring or a like an actual culture, and how that grows, and like what makes it original, I guess.
So I think the two biggest factors, and there's a lot of factors, but the two biggest ones are the age of a consistent, if evolving practice, and its ability to transmit from a core culture and take roots in other cultures that it sees contact with. And I want to use as the perfect example for this the idea of the English common law tradition. English common law goes back as far as the Magna Carta, and it's sort of the bedrock that the Anglo-sphere as a whole is built on. And I think that's the perfect example, because even before they were formalized into code, these were the legal traditions. These were the mores and the practices that the society accepted. And even as other people have encountered these practices, they've adopted them. The transmission of that practice has been accepted. So, it's proven its staying power over time. And it's proven its transmissibility while still being most prevalent in the core it developed in. And I think those are the two signifiers of a real culture, is its ability to stand the test of a great length of time and its transmissibility.
No, that makes sense. So we do have that tradition, I would say, at least in the U.S., but that, like you're saying, that does come from English history. So yeah, that would be interesting. I'm trying to think of something that people would argue is uniquely American, that is transmutable, and we'll try to say stands the test of time, but being that the country is only just over 200 years old, that you can call that into question.
Yeah, and that's exactly my problem with it. We haven't been around truly long enough to have our own bedrock customs yet. The only thing that we've been doing consistently as a people since the United States separated itself formally from the United Kingdom is meddling in places overseas. But that's not even unique to our culture because we got that from the Anglosphere too.
Oh yeah, it's just like the torch was passed from Great Britain to us.
That's exactly what happened. So, again, for those reasons, I think it's far too premature to conclude that the U.S. has its own culture to this point. Now, if there's other things we need to talk about first, let's do it, because I do think we also need to discuss the artificial creation of U.S. culture at some point too, though perhaps later in the program.
Yeah, the other thing to mention is that, you say that the American government is a little over 200 years old, but that doesn't also mean that all the states are that old. There's some states that are significantly younger than the inception of America. And I mean, if one country, if per se Russia were to absorb the Ukraine, that does not mean that the Ukrainians would instantly see themselves as Russian and completely mix their history to the point where they view Russian history as their own. And
Absolutely.
I'm not saying somebody born and raised in Alaska, they probably do see American history as their own. I do not necessarily think they should, but that goes back to your idea of like the artificial creation of the American culture, at least the uh, distributing it amongst newer states.
Sure, sure. And, I think the U.S. is going to see a great deal of problems in trying to create its own culture on the world for just that reason, too. Our states and the territories that constitute them, which are more important than the lines that the government puts on the map, dictate far more about the culture of folk in a given region, than the state borders and state histories ever could. We talk about Cajun culture. We talk about the Rust Belt blue collar traditions. There's the New England aristocracy and the founding families sort of meme. The U.S. does have cultures within it, but there's no pan-American culture, at least in my view.
No, for sure. The U.S. is far too large an area, I would say, and far too diverse to have that unified culture, like you're saying.
So now, with all that being said, well, I don't know. I don't want to trample on you guys here too much. Is there anything there that you want to riff on, or that we should riff on a little bit?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
No, I'm good into I'm good with getting into your thoughts on how our culture is artificially, I guess, produced or steered.
So I think the important thing to really look at here is how we view our traditions of freedom in the U.S. and whether or not those are practically implemented really anywhere. And this all goes back to the Platonic ideals in the Republic, right? There's this grandiose founding mythos, and it's all basically fabricated. We had these great libertarian traditions and these great freedom-seeking values, and they were really only practiced for the first 80 or so years of our national history? But we keep heralding them. we teach them to all of our students in the prisons that we call a school system, and we glorify them constantly in all of our national holidays, rightfully so, because they're great ideals, but they are in no way functionally practiced by the pan-US population, by the great normie masses. And so I think that for those reasons, we would have to be extremely skeptical about calling it an American culture. Because while it is a subculture that we obviously here value very highly, especially on programs like this, there's no reason to believe that, most people around the world could look at those claims and see them as quintessentially American. At least I don't think so. But we do make a very conscious effort to market ourselves that way globally. So perhaps in time it could develop that way. But I do think that going back to earlier discussions about what constitutes a culture does have to be lived practices as well. So unless those actually take root somewhere, and you see attempts at it, like the Free State Project in New Hampshire, unless those are actively lived in places, they can't constitute what we call a culture here.
I will say that historically speaking, if you read something like Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, he talks about how Americans were they have this libertarian bent, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that most of the time the state just couldn't exercise much authority over Americans in general.
Absolutely. We were only living free because we had so much frontier to run to. And now the U.S. is virtually out of frontier by virtue of the government buying up and continuing to own the land that would be considered a frontier. Virtually the only free places left in the U.S., territorially speaking, are the wastes of Alaska.
No, yeah, I have to agree with that. And I think that for either in terms of having a culture of liberty, either you have to be used to that that absence of state authority of seeing like the state apparatus being constantly in your life, or you have to be seeing that and actively fighting against it. And we haven't seen either in the U.S. For a very long time.
Absolutely. There's really nothing you can even plausibly make the argument for either. I think the last real great example, at least that I'm aware of, I'm sure there's others, is something like the Battle of Athens, shortly after World War II, where returning GIs took it upon themselves to basically depose a corrupt local government. And, even then, they only instituted their own good old boys network, but...
Yeah, that's a great example. But yeah, like you say, it always seems to end up being only a slightly better version of what was there before. And even when you talk about the American Revolution, you're just talking about a switching out of the aristocracy and of the elites. You're switching out your old British aristocracy for the newer American one.
Yeah, you got the explicitly defeudalized but still landed gentry, and just replaced it with a new blood sort of gentry of their own. And really, not to get, again, too incredibly woke here on your podcast, but the sort of New England proper aristocracy still more or less rules this country. And they're seeing their own intra-Civil War, culturally speaking, with their own set of upstarts, I think, in the sort of left coast tech bro rising aristocracy, as they've been around now long enough to start becoming landed themselves. But, it's still very much those traditions in which the people with the greatest amount of influence through land and business assets held get to determine what they want to try and make the culture in a given place. And then it becomes a matter of whether or not the serf class, whether the vast majority of the population accepts it and then takes whatever that sort of presented and constructed culture is, or whether they forge one of their own. And I have to say that it's pretty evident in world history that by and large, people have accepted the national mythos of wherever they choose to live and accept the national traditions and practices that are handed to them by their ruling elite, by their state apparatus. But most of that is symptomatic of those systems having been in place for so long. So the U.S., while it does not have its own culture yet, really does have a fairly unique opportunity to forge its own culture because it's not too late to do so yet, unlike a lot of places.
But I'm not entirely sure that would be a good thing.
I'm not necessarily saying it would be either, because I think the average American has a huge authoritarian bent. I think the New England Puritan is a more accurate national stereotype for us than the Tea Party freedom fighter is.
Yeah, here's a theory I have. I believe, as a bit of a preface, that people, you got a dude that is of Norwegian descent or of Danish descent, let's say, and he doesn't do that much that is useful, but he is entirely wrapped up in his Viking ancestors. And I believe that it makes people a bit complacent. I have a friend that is of Irish descent, and he went to vote, and he did not recognize any of the names for the local school board, and but one of their last names was O'Brien. So he's like, oh, he's Irish, so he must be a good dude. And man, that's crazy to me, but I think it makes people a bit complacent. So possibly, to get into the theory, I think that maybe this quote-unquote American culture might have been manufactured to give people some undue pride in their society, but they see that as being synonymous with their government. So that's what gives them their authoritarian bent. Whatever the government's doing, hey, we beat the British, blah, blah, blah. Let's carry on that tradition with the U.S. government. We got the separation of powers. That's basically a ideological saint. So it'll work itself out because, the founding fathers did X, Y, Z to blah, blah, blah. And the core of it is I think it just makes people complacent and just whatever happens, and they're not going to argue or fight about it.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think you're right on the money there.
Yeah, for sure. As someone who has lived overseas, to me, that's especially, it's something that I have noticed, being that I did not really grow up in the U.S., but so I kind of viewed American culture or Americans from a bit of an outsider perspective, but it was pretty easy to, I guess, see kind of how Americans view their culture from that outsider perspective, and it's very simple and easy to adopt, and like you're saying, it's based on a few things, on these little mantras, these little ideas that we beat the British and we love freedom and we're capitalist. It's very simple. I would say.
It's basically the
But
whole
yeah,
marketing tactic of Turning Point USA.
Oh,
yeah.
talk about cringe, Jesus. No, thank you.
I have a simple phrase that can sum it up. People focus more on rememberable events and ideas of the past to the point where they do not pay attention to what is happening to those events and ideas in the present.
Sure, absolutely. But again,
Yeah.
that just goes right back to again, I keep harping on it, but the manufactured nature of it. Again, going back to what Plato wrote in the Republic, it's all manufactured with a very explicit purpose. We are given these national mythos and these ideals from the top, from people who believe themselves to be philosopher kings. And, he wrote all about that in the context of the soul and searching for justice. But to ignore the explicitly political drive of the examples he used, I think would be foolish, because we see them acted out every single day and in the history of everything everywhere.
Yeah, Rousseau
Well,
basically said the same thing. He said, the power is incredibly arbitrary and it is guided by the general will of the people, the sovereign.
No, yeah. Unless you want to say anything more, I say that we get into how the U.S. How our culture, or how our culture is basically manufactured. You were talking earlier about how we still have that New England founding fathers aristocracy still present in the U.S. Did you want to get into that and maybe talk about some of the sources, or some of the things you've read that maybe the listeners can, if they can get into some of that, if they're interested?
Well, I think it'll depend on kind of how you mean. Because when I reference that in the context of this cultural discussion, I really am just talking about how, those were the first drivers of what would become what we're told is American culture. They were the most populated parts of the early American experiment. And I think that that's really what a lot of the responsibility is. They've just had the most time to sit there to accumulate land, power, and influence. So that just naturally gives them the first chance to set their preferences and then to inflict those preferences on us. And while I think that, again, they've done a very good job of projecting the cult of liberty and what I would like to see become our actual culture of liberty, I think the revealed preference of New England governance reveals that they are actually much closer in line with the sort of puritanical exile colonies that founded a lot of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you were talking about just now with their idea of liberty and kind of how it's portrayed. It seems to me that most Americans don't know what liberty is, and we have this very basically our idea of liberty, or the normie idea of liberty, is a bit perverse in a way, and the powers that be, they pay lip service to it, and they'll use it when it suits their purposes. But yeah, it's part of our heritage. But yeah, like you're saying, it's very I'm having a hard time describing it, but yeah, it's very it's used against us, and purposely not defined correctly.
Yeah, I was going to say that like the modern definition of liberty is either like this ethereal idea that nobody has a firm grasp on and nobody's going to bother define, or like in the case of most modern day conservatism, liberty is whatever we have right now, no more. As if like before the Patriot Act was passed, that was an authoritarian thing, but after it was passed, oh, it's in America, so it must be part of liberty because it's America. I do want to
the
mention.
Department of Homeland Security is here to promote and protect your freedom.
Yeah. I also want to mention that, in my mind, two New England authors that were still in line with the founding ideas, whatever those were Ralph Waldo Emerson and, in particular, Henry David Thoreau. And he wrote his famous essay called Civil Disobedience. He wrote it in a jail cell as he was sent to jail for not paying his taxes because he disagreed with, I forget the war, but there was a war. And
Would
that's
that have
pretty
been
bad.
the Mexican-American War?
It very well might have been. I do not remember, but and then there's also the theory that a lot of Americans, I think Pete Raymond had a guy on that was talking about how what's his name? The president before FDR, Woodrow Wilson, was part of this group that was still loyal to the English crown. And that might be that Puritanism there. I'm not sure if that falls in line with that theory. But that's also worth contending with and questioning.
Yeah, I would say that there's that these certain American presidents who were definitely in that Anglophile tradition. I know for sure that Woodrow Wilson, he was actually, I would say, obsessed with like how the British ran things, the British system, and he worked his hardest to get us closer to that.
Yeah, and that's actually really good conspiracy bait, and it might be a topic for another future conversation, but you're exactly right in that sort of, again, that Wilsonian, puritanical, progressive tradition is really the oldest American character. And as you're saying, we can see it in our leaders even up to recent history. And again, to keep borrowing the term from economics, that's the revealed preference of our ruling class, regardless of what they tell us. That's obviously what they want out of us as a population. And it's, again, becoming our question as to whether or not we want to roll over and accept that or to forge our own regional or even pan-regional American culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. Why do you think that when you talk about the Puritan culture, right? It's very disciplined. It rejects, I guess, worldly values, and it values abstinence of several different things. Why is it, do you think, that Puritan ethic is so why do you think that it's been retained, and how do you think that it's used by the elite and the people that are trying to define and steer our culture?
Well, I think it's being used by them because that's what they've allowed to soak into their regional character themselves. They've been steeped in it since their own coming up, and with each generation going back to when they were actual Puritans. I would emphasize personally that I think it has more to do with the features of Puritanism than the values of Puritanism itself. It's that strict, like you were saying, disciplinary streak. It's that sort of authoritarianism of the spirit more than the body. And they've substituted the religious values of it for whatever is most suited to them for maintaining the control mechanism. And I think as cultural standards for a class of people who are already in power and in control, that makes it a natural choice. Because it's a lot easier to rule people who believe they need to be ruled than it is to try and rule over and administrate a culture of free men.
Yeah, and if you were to look at the most elite private schools, and I'm referring to not colleges, but like high schools and such, in the U.S., the most elite private schools in the U.S., a lot of them are like religious schools in at least their founding, and they carry on that tradition in one way or another. And while I am a Christian myself, I do see how like religion can be it can be twisted and used for like perverted purposes. For instance, what I'm trying to get at here is you get this when you're talking about something like the social gospel or something like that. People are trying to change society using state authority, and that they're trying to, I guess, they're trying to shape society in their direction, and in a way, I feel like it's a way of I guess a salvation for them, or at least like it's a self-righteousness thing,
Sure. And I think part of that goes back to what I was saying, though, about it being about the features and the components of that sort of lifestyle more than the actual values of it. Because it's not, it's about
it's convenient.
Right, it's about wanting to replicate those sorts of behaviors on a mass scale and those sort of ingrained expectations of behavior than it is more than anything else.
Yeah, because if you do perpetrate that puritanical culture, then you're really curbing on on a people's ability to create culture, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and I couldn't agree more. Do you have any thoughts, Cotton? You've been quiet here a little bit now.
Yeah, I have heard that not only from just kind of general online discourse, but I've heard that from some very intelligent people. And I noticed that topic coming up more and more in conversation, and it's kind of a crime I haven't delved deeper into that theory. But from what I hear, it makes a hell of a lot of sense. How do you think the Skull and Crossbones frat comes into this?
Yeah.
Skull and Bones, my man.
Skull and Bones.
Yeah, the Skull and Bones. My bad.
Well, I think more than anything else, they are a selection process for induction into the upper echelons of that sort of New England aristocracy.
Yeah.
And I think that has very little to do with practicing this culture they want to push on us, so much as choosing who will be their agents of its distribution. And they are certainly not the only selection filter for those individuals, but they are one of the most prominent ones, especially in more recent history.
Yet no one knows about them, or at least not that I can. People in the group know about them, but
Right.
not normies.
Well, no, and they never will. That's the eternal struggle of people like me. Right? We can bleed to moan all we want about all of this stuff that's going on in the background, but ultimately it goes again back to what we were saying about the cultural control mechanisms. There's just simply no way to wake someone up unless they want to be woke.
It's amazing that most Americans don't know that in 2004, George Bush and John Kerry, who are basically frat brothers, ran against each other for the presidency.
Yeah, it hardly matters whether or not they shared skin-deep ideological differences when they were both sleeping in coffins and jerking off onto the same Ritz crackers, right?
Yeah. Speaking of which, on a fun what on a fun hey no, I'm not. on a funny note, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but on YouTube, the comedy show Whitest Kids You Know.
I have not.
Oh man.
Oh, okay. Well, there's one video out there entitled Trevor Talks to Kids, and it's the comedian Trevor Moore, and he does this video, and he talks about these different conspiracy theories, and one of them is talking about how George Bush Sr. Requested to be there for his son's induction into the Skull and Bones, and that probably involved him watching his son jerk off.
Yeah.
And pause.
And we don't. Go ahead, Kevin.
That video is right up your alley, man. That's a great sketch.
I will have to check it out as soon as we're done recording here. But yeah.
And that one's going in the show notes, right?
Yeah, sure. I'll go in the show notes.
I just wish we knew more about the actual internal practices of the Skull and Bones, because really a lot of it just is speculation and, leaked documents of varying authenticity. But they really are one of the boogeymen groups at the center of this sort of Puritan cabal that rules us from the woods and lakes of New England.
Well, that's like Bohemian Grove, right? Like, we know very little about it, except like what the stuff Alex Jones recorded back in the day.
Yeah, we know very, very little about it. There's been a couple of actual attendance rolls that have been put out to the public. Whether or not those are complete and full is up for debate. Whether or not any of the past ones have been is also up for debate. All we really know about it is that Nixon called it what he called it. And even then, what the hell does that even mean? Because he still attended anyways, you know? So
I think that means he's the pot calling the kettle black.
Exactly. So it's we know these groups because we've been able to find just enough to prove that they exist. But again, the function of them is virtually actually unknown, and it's a matter of deductive reasoning to try and figure out what the hell they're up to. And I guess we're a little in the weeds here, but I think that those two are the biggest boogeymen groups, again, I'm going to keep using that word, to keep in mind from a specifically American perspective. Because there's a lot of international groups too. But the ones you have to keep your eye on are the ones that are trying to engineer the public here in the U.S. That's where we are, and that's the subject we're talking about tonight, is the control mechanism of American culture. And the Bohemian Grove, too, I think is a little bit more of an international group. You know, they take membership from all over the place. But the Skull and Bones is a almost entirely American and certainly entirely subsided within the Anglosphere tradition.
I don't want to get further into the weeds, but I'm taking a shot in the dark here because I've never read it. How do you think? The Sterner book. What's it called? The Ego and Its Own, I think.
That's his big work, yeah, his seminal treatise.
Yeah. Do you think that fits into this a bit?
I will be horrifically blunt with you and say I don't know because I have not read Sterner personally.
Okay. Because I hear a lot about spooks in relation to cultural icons and ideas, and I'm not incredibly sure what the definition of it is, but I think it fit in this conversation. What about Propaganda by Bernays?
Nope, sorry. I apologize. But I can answer that question a little bit about spooks. You know, the idea of spooks in the Sternerite egoist tradition is really just the idea of the things that you let have free real estate in your head. And the ideas that you let become deterministic in your actions, whether they have any right to or not. You know, it's about very much so controlling your own thought process, controlling how you will act upon the world instead of letting the ideas that get lodged in your head do it.
Okay, so it's kind of like outsourcing ethics a bit.
When you allow spooks to be present, that's what it is. But the point of Sternerism is to not allow it.
Yeah.
Earlier, you mentioned like the West Coast tech bros. How do you think that they fit into? How do you think they fit into shaping culture?
I think that they are a rising insurgent power against this sort of New England Puritan structure. And I do not think that their rule would be any for the better. I just think that they are the next supra class, the next strata of American society that will have accumulated enough institutional influence and actual landed power to be able to just contest that control system, is what I'm getting at.
Okay, so they're more competitors.
They are the next pretender to the throne, is what they are, yeah.
Okay.
Who are we talking about?
Tech culture.
Okay, right, yeah. Yeah, that's some spooky stuff, man. Like I
know
think,
a lot of libertarians actually really like Peter Thiel, but I'll be honest, that dude sketches me the fuck out.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that he's like actually doing the regular blood transfusions to keep himself young, the literal scientific vampirism shit, it's that is him, right? I'm not misattributing that.
No,
because I know a lot of people do it, but I think he's one of the big practitioners too.
I think he does it, and I think Jeff Bezos does it as well. Hormone replacement therapy.
Good night.
Yeah, dude, these people are literal vampires.
They absolutely are. And, again, they are really, this is why the idea of Lockean homesteading and being able to mix property with labor to make it your own is so important. Because while these class stratas will not allow us to practice this, that is exactly what gives them the ability to vie for control of what our cultural standards will be.
That is really interesting. Trying to extend the idea of homesteading to culture. That is I'd never thought of it that way, but hell yeah, that works perfectly. It's like it's back to the spook thing. It's what do you allow to have free reign in your mind?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point, right? What ideas will you permit to become dominant in your own soulscape? And
Yeah,
these people think they're vying for control over our souls via our minds. And we can't permit that. The problem is they hold all the physical assets to be able to marshal resources to do it.
yeah, and that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about culture being like a voluntary practice. Uh, just because you're born in America, we see it all the time. Just because you're born in America doesn't mean you necessarily have a wholly American personal attachment in the same sense as a lot of people might. But I think a lot of people don't see it that way, even though it is. They see it as. I'll take myself for example. To most people, Louisiana has a incredibly specific culture, but it does not. What most people think is Louisiana culture is South Louisiana culture, and in particular, Southeast Louisiana culture.
Yeah, the
And
Bayou
then,
Bros, the Cajun
yes,
culture.
exactly. And then, the further north you get in the state, the less you see of that. You still see it, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it is in places like New Orleans. Um, but oh damn, I forgot where I was going with this.
Well, I just have to say, for what it's worth, I'm a little bit jealous of the Cajuns because even that culture itself got its start up in Canada and at the
Yeah,
Wisconsin fur trading outposts until they got pushed out of the top of the Mississippi and had to float all the way downriver. And I wish we'd retained a little bit of it up here because I absolutely love the cooking.
oh yeah, man. You ever had a coffee with chicory in it?
I've not had the chicory coffee, but really I'm specifically thinking about gator because I
Oh yeah.
love gator.
Well, I will say that is not as prevalent here anymore. Um, you'll probably find more restaurants serving gator in Florida, but you do find a hell of a lot of I mean catfish is a big thing down here that you can get anywhere.
What a
Boudin.
crying shame.
I mean, I've had gator here. I've had gator in northern Louisiana. So I mean, it's still there. You can still find it fairly easily, but it's probably not as easy as it once was.
Yeah, return to tradition, man. Don't let that shit go.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say about chicory coffee, because like the story is, in the Great Depression, people in the South would add this chicory to just kind of up the volume of coffee. They basically cut the coffee because less actual coffee beans were available, and it added this very specific flavor profile, and it has become I mean, that's all what some people drink down here. I mean, you can in damn near every grocery store you can go buy some Cafe Du Monde coffee with chicory in it, and it's pretty awesome.
So we're gonna get totally off topic here, but I have to ask, what is the flavor profile of chicory coffee though? Because it's something I would be interested in trying.
um, it has a bitter taste. Uh, it tastes like I don't know, like when you maybe um like chicory itself is a just a plant. It's not necessarily a like most people when they drink it they think it's wood because it has a very woody flavor, but it's actually a flower, and I don't want to I don't necessarily want to get hung up on this because it's going to sound bad, but it tastes like bark a bit, but it's really good. It's kind of hard to explain. It makes it
So
taste a bit tanniny, maybe just a bit bitter, maybe a bit more acidic.
okay, so those are all good keywords. Because if you had persisted down the woody route, and I know you didn't, but if you had, my next line of question would have been, are you talking like oaky? sort of flavor or whatnot, and obviously that's not the case, so I'm glad you corrected me preemptively there.
Yeah, it's not as sweet as like what a oaky coffee would taste like, or it's definitely not as sweet as like what a maple or pecan coffee would taste like.
Okay.
You know, I'll retract that last bit. It might taste a bit like pecan, but like a very bitter pecan.
Interesting.
Speaking of bitter, you guys have made this transition back to our line of our topic very difficult for me. I've been sitting here this whole time trying to figure it out. But to wrap it up, I think I hear a car alarm in the background. I don't.
That's just the
I don't know if it's
NSA
here.
coming for you.
That's right.
Ew. But anyway, to wrap up, one thing that I wanted to talk about was well, first of all, how do you think that we can fight the propaganda and the shaping of our culture by the elites, and specifically, do you think that the internet is a good tool for that, or is that more of a it's a tool for it definitely, but how much of a tool for the elites is it, and can it be subverted? I mean, I think it can, but I'm pretty paranoid in terms of like its potential and how it can be subverted on us.
Yeah, so I think that you are rightfully paranoid. I do think that it can be actively subverted and used as a tool for us and for our causes, but only when you are very specifically disseminating your own information and creating decentralized, anti-fragile social networks. You know, jerking ourselves and our egos off on Twitter fighting with retards is not an effective use of the internet. That's what they want you to use it. You know,
Yeah.
all the real work being done with the internet is happening with people like, you know, the 3D printers and the secret key-based chat groups. You know, that's where the real value of the internet is. It's not on the forward-facing social networks. But the real key to fighting back is not any part of the internet either. The real key to fighting back is what I was saying earlier about recognizing that you have to homestead your own mind, and where you have the consent to do so, to homestead the mind of others, you need to live the culture of the natural myth, because they don't want you to actually live it, only merely to believe it.
Yeah, you need to live the culture of the natural myth. Yeah, can you explain that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so it's like we've been saying throughout, right? They've given us this national mythos and then disallowed us from practicing it through the authoritarian control structures. But the problem is, in creating that national myth, the sort of double-edged blade of it is that if enough people practice it, if enough people use it, then they do in fact lose control, and we integrate it into ourselves and into our own practices. And that's what we need to be doing. You know, it's not merely enough to live something as a matter of faith or belief, or to accept something as a matter of belief or faith, but you also then have to put it into practice and to actively live it. You know, it's that sort of t-shirt slogan you see floating around on libertarian merchandise sites. You need to become ungovernable.
Yeah, it's taking that the cultural tropes and actually living it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cotton, did you have any final thoughts?
I think that if you do not have, just to kind of rephrase what Paz said, I think that if you do not enact the ethical, in the classical sense, the ethical extensions of a particular culture, then it is not necessarily your culture. It's more of just like a mind application that you cannot act upon. And
It's
I
basically
think that
malware sitting in your wet works.
yes, exactly. And I think that if you do not engage upon that culture, then it is more. It's not only useless, but it's more of just something that's taking up space rather than helping you in any way.
Yeah, and kind of my final thoughts here is I would encourage the listeners to take one action, or take one of the ways that you can homestead your mind, and put your ethics into action, whether that be some method of agorism, or whatever it is, growing a garden, starting a side hustle,
Actually taking your guns to the range.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Just something beyond, like what you were saying, is arguing on the what we all like to do is argue on the internet, and call people status, and own
The libs.
normies, right? Own the
Buy
libs,
more
right?
libs.
But yeah, I would just encourage the listeners to take the one thing that interests them the most in terms of state subverting activities, and try to apply that in the coming months. And that's how, if we have any chance of seeing more liberty in our lifetime, you have to put your beliefs into practice, and that's, yeah, that's how we're gonna get out of this eventually, in my opinion. Paz, I'll turn it over to you for any final thoughts that you have, and then let's hear your plugs.
Yeah, I think I did a pretty good job of blasting out my actual thoughts here. I'm sure that I will have more in the coming days, because my brain just doesn't turn off even when I want it to. But I think that about covers it for now, though, if you'll permit me to transition to plugs.
Go for it.
I am one of the hosts of the Gaslight Hour podcast. You can find us on most podcatchers. We have been dropping a lot of episodes recently, so please go listen to them. I also have a library channel, that's the lbry.tv, where I archive all my guest podcast appearances after they drop with whoever actually recorded them. I am most prevalent on the social media platform known as Twitter, where you can find me at DogmanRespecter. And if any of you out there are podcast hosts, please have me on your show. I will go anywhere and I will talk about anything. And, even if you've just got casual questions for me, I am pretty open to discussing anything with anyone. Provided it's not excessively degenerate or anything.
I have one more thing to say. I've mentioned this book a lot on the show, but I'd recommend everybody read F.A. Hayek's The Fatal Conceit, because he talks a good bit about how nature interplays with culture. And it's an incredibly fascinating read, and it's not that long. So
Yeah, actually, on that note, if I could just give one more plug, I will say that probably the biggest influence on my development as a libertarian was the sci-fi author Robert Heinlein. And a lot of what I think about culture and the creation of culture actually comes from his seminal work, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Yeah.
So if your listenership has not read it yet, they really should immediately. It's a wonderful book. It's a very fun story. And when you let it sort of stew in your brain, you will come out of it significantly more anarchist and significantly more well-informed than you would reading any given piece of theory, in my opinion.
Well, man, it was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
We appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with the two of you. I think this was a super productive and super enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, and I definitely think you'll be a repeat guest here on Dissecting Liberty.
Hell yeah.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, man. Talk to you later. Oh, wait.
That's going in.
This is Liberty Zero reminding you to zero your rifle.
And this is Cotton Archist reminding you to pick cotton voluntarily.